The green supply chain rules are set to rattle the global economy. Companies are being told to calculate and disclose emissions, quote unquote. This is by Vince Bielski, Real Clear Investigations on WND. Making a box of Cocoa Puffs is a complicated global affair. It could start with cocoa farms in Africa, cornfields in the US, or sugar plantations in Latin America. Then thousands of processors, transporters, packagers, distributors, office workers, and retailers join the supply chain before a kid in Minnesota, where General Mills is based, pours the cereal into his bowl. Now imagine the challenge that General Mills faces in counting the greenhouse gas emissions from all of these people, machines, vehicles, buildings, and other products involved in this Cocoa Puff supply chain, then multiply that by 100 plus brands belonging to the food giant. Thousands of public companies may soon have such a daunting task to comply with a new set of climate rules proposed by the Securities and Exchange Commission, held by prominent environmental groups as a long-sought victory. The sweeping plan released in late March would force companies to grapple with the unpredictable impact of climate change by disclosing reams of new information to investors. What are your company's climate risks, such as severe weather, and the possible financial impacts? How have the threats affected your business strategies, and what's the plan to avoid the dangers? The most consequential and controversial piece of the SEC's proposed regulations would require corporations to calculate their total greenhouse gas footprint, including from the supply chain. The regulations also carry political weight for Democrats in the run-up to the midterms in November. The Biden administration and centrist Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia are trying again to breathe life into the clean energy legislation that died earlier this year amid a feud between them. If this latest effort at compromising fails, with Manchin reportedly looking for federal support for fossil fuels as well as renewable energy, then much of President Biden's ambitious climate agenda will be left riding on the SEC proposal. SEC head Gary Gensler says shareholders are demanding climate risk disclosures to make smarter investment decisions and hold companies accountable for greenwashing, quote unquote, their operations. The regulations will also provide investors in the environmental, social, governance, ESG movement more leverage in their ongoing campaigns to pressure companies to reduce their carbon footprints. While many companies like Walmart and business groups like the Chamber of Commerce generally support the idea of required climate disclosures, they object to what they see as the SEC's heavy-handedness in standardizing rules across the economy. The Chamber is calling for flexibility so companies can customize their climate disclosures based on what's relevant to their businesses and investors. Counting supply chain emissions? The biggest beef from companies is a rule that would require them to calculate and disclose supply chain emissions called Scope 3. Big companies have thousands of suppliers operating in hundreds of countries, making the task of coming up with a reasonable accounting enormously complicated. First of all, many suppliers of products and services are private companies not under the control of the SEC. They may refuse to cooperate in account because of the costs and implications that they might have to change their business practices to reduce emissions, said Professor Gerald Patchett, who has analyzed the problems of supply chain reporting. Another obstacle is that many smaller companies, like General Mills cocoa farmers in Africa, don't have the capacity to measure the emissions from their own fertilizers, tractors, and farming practices. So companies will have to rely on broad country or industry averages that likely don't reflect the actual emissions created by the suppliers, according to researchers. The data that companies will be asked to collect from thousands of suppliers is mind-boggling and certainly unprecedented, said Patchett, who researchers environmental policy and business. He says it's an idealized concept of what can actually be done by a company. The upshot is that regulations meant to bring clarity to investors on climate risk may end up providing highly unreliable emissions disclosures, leaving them worse off, wrote SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce, a Trump appointee who voted against the 500-page proposal. It forces investors to view companies through the eyes of a vocal set of stakeholders for whom a company's climate reputation is of equal or greater importance than a company's financial performance. Birth of the investor campaign. 2 decades ago, the international environmental group CDP pioneered the strategy of organizing institutional investors to pressure companies around the world to reveal at least a piece of their carbon footprint. The CDP pitch: if companies figure out which part of their sprawling global operation produce the most emissions, from farming and manufacturing to distribution and consumer use, they are better able to reduce them. For automakers, most emissions come from driving vehicles, not making them. For tech firms, it's the opposite. Manufacturing devices is a bigger climate issue than using them. CDP's campaigns have made grinding progress over the years. In 2021, it gathered more than 160 global investment firms, including bond giant PIMCO, Harvard Management Company, and hedge fund AQR Capital Management, to target 1,300 companies worldwide. They're asked to make a long list of climate-related disclosures on CDP's platform. Some companies have resisted the pressure, while others likely have been shamed into making rudimentary examinations of their emissions to appease investors. In all, about 570 U.S. public companies, an estimated 15% of the total, have reported a bit of climate data to London-based CDP, with Intel and PepsiCo among the dozens that earned high ranks for transparency. More recently, some companies have come to see climate change as a direct threat to the bottom line, particularly those that depend on commodities like General Mills. It did not require much pushing from investors to begin studying its own supply chain to find that farming is by far the biggest emissions hotspot, mostly through the use of chemical fertilizers and tilling of the soil, which releases sequestered carbon. In a candid 2021 Global Responsibility Report, the company said extreme weather events were already hurting its ability to deliver quality food products. With the backing of CDP and investment Goliaths like BlackRock, the SEC now wants to turn its scattershot voluntary reporting into a mandatory regime for most public companies. The easier pieces force companies to report emissions from operations they own or control, such as corporate headquarters Scope 1 and the energy they use Scope 2. Some firms already send this data to CDP without much trouble. Scope 3 rule on counting emissions from the chain of thousands of suppliers, on the other hand, may be a world of trouble. The agency acknowledges that it does not have a handle on the costs, but that they may be significant as companies hire consultants, accountants, and data specialists to do the job. But since the vast majority of emissions come from supply chains, environmental groups are advocating that Scope 3 remain in the final SEC regulations after the 60-day public comment period. Big companies could start making disclosures to the agency as early as 2024, although lawsuits challenging the authority of the SEC to make climate rules are likely. Julie Nash, Senior Program Director at Ceres, another prominent investor advocacy group, says, "We see the disclosure of Scope 3 emissions as essential in order to make sure that companies have plans to be able to address those emissions. Disclosure is the essential first step," she said. Lessons from the food industry. Ceres, however, also knows how tough it will be for companies to calculate supply chain emissions from its own campaign focusing on the food industry. The industry is the perfect target. It produces a third of all greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. A third, according to the UN agency. For many of these companies, the supply chain generates about 80% of the total emissions. Last year, Boston-based Ceres organized more than 30 institutional investors, including giants such as Allianz Global Investors, to press 50 food companies to report Scope 3 emissions. Ceres used the same reporting requirements called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as the SEC proposes in its rules. The protocol covers 15 reporting categories from the beginning of a product's creation to the end of its life. McDonald's, for instance, would have to account for emissions from the production of beef it buys from many countries. The disclosures would include processing and transporting the ingredients packaging the products, disposing of the waste, and burning energy along the way. Then there are emissions from business offices, the commuting of 200,000 employees, and the operation of 40,000 restaurants globally. You can imagine what's involved. So how is Ceres' Young campaign going? So far, few, if any, of the 50 companies are fully reporting their supply chain emissions. Only 23 disclose some of them, according to Ceres. Nash says the complexity of counting emissions and the lack of data pose big obstacles for food companies. Consider how a food company would have to account for beef supplied from Brazil. The cattle may move to 5 different ranches before reaching the slaughterhouse. The company would need to know precise details of operations of each of those ranches. What did the cattle eat at each ranch? How efficiently did animals turn food into meat? Did their grazing cause the destruction of forests? Which store carbon in trees and soil? Which of these factors, which differ depending on the ranch and the country, significantly affects the carbon footprint of cattle? I mean, you can understand. This is ridiculous. Nash, a PhD who directs Ceres Food and Forest Program, says it's very difficult for companies to trace this information because there are so many different stages in the supply chain. So there's a great deal of work that needed to improve traceability and transparency to have the most accurate numbers for a Scope 3 analysis. General Mills emission count. General Mills stands out among the 50 companies. A spokesperson for the company, which makes breakfast cereal, soups, pizza, and pet food, says it follows almost all of the reporting protocols in its quest to reduce its emissions 30% by 2030. The company's Scope 3 calculation revealed that 54% of its emissions come from growing and transporting crops and turning them into food ingredients. According to its website, General Mills breaks out 28 categories of emissions, including packaging at 8% and consuming its products such as shopping and cooking at 17%. But how accurate are any of these emission numbers? It's impossible to say. The maker of Cocoa Puffs does not send bean counters to every cocoa farm in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire to find out the precise types of fertilizers, tractors, fuel, and agricultural practices they use. That would be prohibitively expensive given that the company has suppliers operating in more than 100 countries. Instead, General Mills and other companies use life cycle assessment, LCA, computer models to tally emissions, but these models, like those used in everything from economics to climate science, are only as accurate as the consultants who design them and the data that's fed into them. The data is the biggest problem. General Mills hired the consulting firm Qantas to calculate its supply chain emissions. Qantas uses national averages for particular businesses like cocoa farms in Ghana that may be several steps removed from the actual farms that supply General Mills, creating uncertainty about the accuracy of the estimates. Nor do computer models typically include some of the biggest sources of emissions, such as the release from tilling the soil and from converting forests and grasslands, which sequester carbon to crops. Qantas did not respond to a request for an interview. We need more accurate estimates of our baseline emissions, Stephen Rosenweig, a soil scientist at General Mills, told U.S. Department of Agriculture in February. He said using these databases means our current footprint is static. It does not change from year to year. It also might be based on the global average that is not very relevant to the practices that farmers in our supply sheds are using. To make better Scope 3 estimates, Rosenweig said companies need to develop more sophisticated data tracking systems, which will require satellites to monitor changes to land use. In the meantime, General Mills is taking the ambitious step of attempting to transform the agricultural practices of its farmers in the U.S. and abroad who supply key ingredients like wheat, oats, dairy, and cocoa. The company and industry partners are financing efforts to support and train farmers in regenerative agriculture. It uses less fertilizer and tilling to reduce emissions and other methods to improve the health of soil, which is rapidly degrading worldwide. General Mills has more than 115,000 acres enrolled in its regenerative management programs and aims for 1 million acres by 2030. Rosenweig said, "We consider regenerative agriculture to be our greatest opportunity for meeting our commitment to reduce our climate footprint by 30% by the year 2030. Seeking principle-based rules, advocates of the SEC proposal say today's reporting flaws will be improved as more companies develop Scope 3 expertise and collect better data to share with each other. The number of companies that disclose emissions to CDP continues to grow every year, showing it's just a matter of time. Professor Patchett disagrees, saying that forcing companies to make such elaborate disclosures is a waste of resources. Big firms already have a general understanding of the main source of their emissions, such as agriculture and the food industry. The money needed to produce a precise accounting of emissions, he says, would be better spent on actually reducing them. McDonald's, for instance, did not need a full accounting of its greenhouse gas footprint to pledge to reach net zero by 2050. Given the difficulties in determining supply chain emissions, the SEC has carved out a few exemptions. For instance, small firms such as those with less than 100 million in revenue won't have to comply. The companies also will be shielded from lawsuits for passing on faulty data, providing they had a reasonable basis for disclosing it. The SEC says it will help investors judge the reliability of the disclosures by requiring companies to reveal the sources of the data, including economic and government studies, suppliers, consultants, and other third parties. Asking investors to wade through all of those footnotes is a tall order, but it's not unlike what they already do with other financial disclosures, said Michael Lepek, Stanford professor of environmental engineering, who's worked with LCA models. When you read a financial statement, businesses talk about significant uncertainties associated with the assets and liabilities, he said. It's just buried in the extensive notes, and carbon accounting is in many regards no different than that. But the Chamber of Commerce, a business lobby, says the Scope 3 mandate may leave investors more confused than informed. The Chamber is pushing for an open-ended reporting mandate based on general principles to determine what's relevant for investors rather than precise rules, such as a Scope 3 protocol. Companies and their investors should be left to determine the necessary metrics, which means some may choose to report Scope 3 and others won't, said Evan Williams, director of Chamber's Center for Capital Markets. Critics of this principles-based approach say it's so vague that companies will find ways to avoid any meaningful accounting of their carbon footprint. Williams said there is that concern, but what we have seen is that companies are responsive to their investors, and if they demand more information on climate risks, the companies have provided it. This was from Real Clear Investigations on WND. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.